Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. Today I'm going to talk about a case that I've spent a while researching and I still don't know what to make of it. Is it schizophrenia, an elaborate hoax, or something beyond explanation? I first read about it in a book called Creatures from Inner Space by Stan Gooch, and this led me to the book The Story of Ruth, written by a psychologist named Morton Shatzman. Shatzman is the psychologist who treated Ruth directly, and he documented his findings in this book, so I'll be drawing on it quite heavily as a source for this video. Most of the names in the book were changed to protect the identity of those involved, so I'll just be referring to people by the names given in the book. In 1976, 25-year-old housewife Ruth led a seemingly ordinary life. She was married with 3 children and had recently settled in England after moving from America. Her mental health crisis began in a fairly typical way. The stresses of her day-to-day life, the housework, and the raising of 3 children seemed to be getting to her. She began to feel emotionally overstretched. She became withdrawn from her children. She began to dread the sound of them waking up in the morning. She began to hate being in the same room with them. When her youngest daughter, 15-month-old Yvonne, began crying, Ruth had to fight the urge to lock Yvonne in her room and run away. Their home was a mess as Ruth became unable to do the housework. She also became extremely fearful of visitors. Whenever there was a knock at the door, Ruth was overcome with anxiety. At the same time, she became terrified of public spaces. If she was in a crowded place, she became panicked and claustrophobic. Eventually, she stopped going out altogether. This agoraphobia, combined with a fear of having visitors, meant that she became unable to see any of her friends. Her relationship with her husband Paul began to suffer as well. They had been married for 8 years and things had been going well, but recently, whenever they made love, Ruth felt violated and dirty. She began to push him away too. With this emotional detachment from her family and her inability to see friends, Ruth became extremely isolated and withdrawn. At the same time, she was overcome with a sense of guilt. She felt like a failure as a wife and a mother. She started to feel ill every time she ate and rapidly lost weight. And then the nightmare started. The most common nightmare was a sort of sleep paralysis experience. Ruth would seemingly awaken in her own bed, but was completely unable to move. She would then feel a strange tingling sensation rising from her feet and up her body. As the sensation reached her mouth, she would begin to scream, and then blood would spatter out of her mouth and cover the walls of the bedroom. These night terrors happened every time she fell asleep, so she became scared of going to bed. She would attempt to stay awake to avoid having this nightmare, and so she became even more tired and withdrawn during the day. After some weeks of this, she began having an even more disturbing nightmare. She began to dream of her father. Now, to understand these nightmares, and a lot of what else happens in this story, we have to look at Ruth's childhood. Ruth's father was a violent drunk who spent a lot of time in jail. During her formative years, he was in and out of Ruth's life. She says at times he could be very kind and fatherly, but a lot of the time, especially when he was drinking, he was very abusive. Then, when Ruth was 10 years old, her father came into her room in the middle of the night and subjected her to a horrific sexual assault. Ruth later told her mother what happened. Her mother said that she didn't believe her, but at the same time she told Ruth that she must never mention what happened to anybody else because her father would go to jail. She then kicked Ruth out of the house. Ruth spent a few weeks at a friend's house before being moved into care, and she would spend the next 7 years of her life there. Life in the care home was very tough. She would regularly get into fights with the other troubled girls who lived there. She did occasionally encounter her father during those years, and on a few occasions he appears to have tried to kill her. One time he shot a gun directly at her, missing her head by inches. Another time he followed her to the care home and tried to run her over in his car. As you can imagine, the assault at 10 years old and the impact that it had on her life afterwards had a pretty traumatic effect on Ruth. Now, at the age of 25, those traumas seem to be resurfacing. In her nightmares, Ruth dreamt that she was 10 years old again, reliving the assault from her father. The worst thing about these nightmares was that upon waking, she would turn to her husband in the bed next to her and she would see her father lying there. This is a fairly common type of hallucination. I know that I've experienced the same thing. I'll be dreaming of somebody and then when I wake up I'll see them there for a few seconds afterwards. But for Ruth, these hallucinations began bleeding into her waking life. At times during the day she would look at her husband and for a fleeting moment he would look exactly like her father. Eventually she started seeing her father's face in other disturbing places. I've told you that when I look at Paul, I sometimes see my father's face, but that's not all. Sometimes, even when I've been awake, I've seen my father as I've been looking at Yvonne, who's 15 months. Yvonne cries and wakes me up. It may be that I've been having a nightmare. I go to pick her up and hold her. I reach down to her crib to get her, and I see my father's face, his face upon hers. I hear him laughing and her crying, but his laugh is smothering her crying sounds. I want to reach out to her, but I'd be touching him, so I'm afraid to reach for her. It was at this point that Ruth sought psychiatric help, and she started to see Dr. Morton Shatzman. Shatzman was an extremely experienced psychologist. He was able to reassure Ruth that she wasn't going crazy. He told her that, although it was frightening, these experiences were simply the result of stress, sleep deprivation, and past trauma, and they were very treatable. But despite his reassurances, the symptoms just kept getting worse. Over time, Ruth began to sense a presence in her house. Even when she was alone, she felt as if something was there with her, following her from room to room. She says this feeling was one of complete terror, the sensation of some unseen thing watching her every move, and somehow she knew that this presence was her father. At this point, some of you might be thinking that this is starting to sound like a haunting, but the thing is, Ruth's father was still alive and living thousands of miles away in America, and she knew this. Still though, she was adamant that this invisible entity was definitely him. Some days later, things escalated again, and this entity appeared to take on a frightening reality. Ruth got up one morning. She walked into her dining room, and there, sat at the dining table, was her father. Now, this wasn't like before. She wasn't sensing some invisible presence or hallucinating his face on somebody else. He was sat there, real as day, drinking a cup of coffee and grinning at her. Her first thought was that he must have travelled from America and snuck into her house. Perhaps all these nightmares and hallucinations had been a premonition of his visit, but this didn't make sense. She knew that he didn't have enough money to buy a plane ticket. Ruth ran to the bedroom and woke her husband Paul. Together they returned to the dining room to confront her father, but as you've probably guessed, Paul didn't see anybody sat at the table. The scary thing is, Ruth could still see him. Her father was just sat there, sipping his coffee and waving at her in a mocking way as if to say, "I know you can see me, and nobody else can." From then onwards, this apparition of Ruth's father became a permanent fixture in the house. Although Paul told her that nobody was there, Ruth could see her father walking around the house as if he lived there. He would go from room to room, opening and closing doors, fixing himself coffee, smoking cigarettes, and sitting on the furniture. Understandably, Ruth assumed that she was losing her mind. Dr. Shatzman sent Ruth and Paul to the Arbor Center. This was a sort of care home for people who were experiencing psychological distress. It was a chance for them to rest and recuperate whilst a family friend looked after the kids at home. Unfortunately, Ruth was unable to escape her problems. On the second day at the Arbor Centre, the apparition of her father appeared once again and began following her around. And she wasn't able to just ignore this hallucination. The sight of it filled Ruth with an overwhelming sense of dread. She felt that her father was trying to kill her. So real was this apparition that she believed that he would be able to push her onto some train tracks or take a knife from the kitchen and stab her. Every time she saw him, she would go into hysterics, sobbing uncontrollably. It rendered her completely unable to function in her day-to-day life. Dr. Shatzman was puzzled. He didn't know how to categorize what Ruth was experiencing. In his line of work, he'd encountered many people with psychosis, but he felt that Ruth wasn't displaying the usual signs of schizophrenia. She was aware that what she was seeing wasn't real, she just couldn't control how she reacted to it. Dr. Shatzman felt that dosing her up on tranquilizers and antipsychotic medication wouldn't really help in the long run. Instead, he suggested that Ruth try to face her hallucination head-on and try to assert some level of control over it. During numerous therapy sessions, if the apparition of her father was present, Dr. Shatzman would tell Ruth to assertively demand that it go away. At first, Ruth was very resistant. She was too afraid to even look at it, let alone speak to it. But after a while, her confidence grew slightly and she began telling it to leave. This apparition was equally resistant at first. When Ruth told it to leave, it would laugh and say things like, "You can't make me go, you're stuck with me forever." But after a while, it would get up and walk out of the room. Ruth and Paul eventually returned home, but Ruth was still plagued by this vision of her father. He would appear in her bed or stand there watching her as she bathed. Even when she couldn't see him, she could hear him moving around in other rooms, or she could smell his body odour lingering in the air. But she kept on being assertive towards him, and over time she felt like she began to get more and more control over this hallucination. Eventually she found that she could make the apparition appear and disappear at will, and what's even stranger is she found that she could conjure up the apparition of other people too. With practice, Ruth found that she could hallucinate her husband, Dr. Shatzman, her grandmother, and her best friend. To Ruth, these hallucinations were completely solid and they seemed to interact with the world like anybody else. For example, whilst Ruth was in the bath, she hallucinated that her friend walked into the room, squeezed some toothpaste onto a toothbrush, and then left. Ruth could clearly see this toothbrush resting on the sink where the hallucination had left it. There was a blob of toothpaste on it, and there was a dent left in the middle of the tube where it had been squeezed. However, once the hallucination ended, the toothbrush was back in its holder and the tube appeared to be untouched. She began to use these apparitions as company when she was feeling lonely. If her husband was at work, she could conjure him up and he would behave and interact with her as if the real person was there. As Ruth gained more power over her hallucinations, the fear of her father diminished. Unless she deliberately manifested his apparition, she no longer hallucinated that he was there. Now, I know what a lot of you might be thinking at this point. How do we know any of what Ruth described was true? Couldn't she simply be inventing the whole story, casting herself as the main character in her own elaborate fantasy? Dr. Shatzman wondered this too. After all, he only had Ruth's word to rely on. There was no independent proof that she was truly seeing what she said she was. And so he devised a number of experiments to test her. For example, they had a test for psychiatric patients who claimed to be blind. In the 70s, this condition was known as hysterical blindness, a blindness caused by a mental disorder rather than some actual physical impairment. They would hook electrodes to the patient's scalp, and this way they could measure the brain's reactions to visual inputs. They would then sit them in front of a screen that would flash a pattern at regular intervals. The brainwaves of a patient with hysterical blindness would show a reaction to the pattern even though they claimed that they couldn't see it. They did this test on Ruth. They hooked her up to the machine and sat her in front of the monitor. They recorded her brainwaves as she looked at the pattern on the screen. And then they asked her to conjure up an apparition and have it place its hands over her eyes. They then repeated the test. The readout on the machine showed that Ruth's brain did react both times to the pattern on the screen, but when the apparition was covering her eyes, the readout was severely diminished. It was as if this hallucination had overridden her sensory pathways, leading to a measurable drop in cortical activity. Now, I won't go into every experiment that they did, but they tested her response to various sensory inputs, and they got confirmation each time that the hallucinations were having a measurable impact on her neural responses. The hairs on her arm would even react to temperature changes caused by the apparitions. Keep in mind that this was the 70s. The technology available to them and their understanding of the human mind were far more limited than they are today. Still though, by the end of the tests, Dr. Shatzman and several other psychologists were convinced that Ruth's responses couldn't have been faked. As time progressed and Ruth worked on her visions, she started to gain another interesting ability. She could conjure up the vision of a person, or even a past version of herself, and then sort of enter the mind of the apparition and see the world from their perspective, feeling all of their thoughts and emotions. It was as if she could deliberately become possessed by the apparition. During these trances, she would speak to the psychologists as if she was that person. She was able to conjure up the apparition of herself as a child and then use that vision to recall events and details from her childhood that she'd completely forgotten about. They were able to use these trances to work through Ruth's trauma. Now, this might sound pretty messed up, but Dr. Shatzman made her create the apparition of her father and then use it to see her own assault, but from his perspective. Whether the memories that she accessed during these possessions accurately reflected the memories of the people that she was claiming to channel is impossible to tell, but what mattered was that she was able to work through her feelings about these people through her trances. She was able to confront her past traumas, see them from a different perspective, and gain a better understanding of them. So, I said at the beginning of this video that there might be something unexplainable about this story. So far, everything I've described, although very strange, is well within the scope of reality. Psychiatric patients having extremely vivid hallucinations is not uncommon, but there are a few incidents described in the book that make me wonder if there's something else going on here. One time, Ruth and her husband Paul were at home, and Ruth conjured up one of her apparitions. At that exact moment, their cocker-spaniel dog started going wild, barking and jumping about as if in a frenzy. The dog kept reacting for about 5 minutes after the vision had faded. So, could the dog have possibly seen the apparition? It's a long shot, and you're probably thinking a dog barking for no reason isn't exactly proof of anything. So, how about this? Some years after Ruth first started having her visions, she travelled back to America and met her father. At some point during their visits, Ruth and her father are walking back towards Ruth's car. As she walks towards the vehicle, she decides to manifest the apparition of her husband sitting in the front seat of the car. My car was down the street maybe 20 yards away and was half in shadow from a nearby tree. I made an apparition of Paul sitting behind the steering wheel. He had shadows across his face, but I could see him plainly. I told Daddy, who was standing next to me, to look in the car because I thought someone was sitting there. "Oh yeah," he said, "it looks like a ghost sitting there. Isn't that the damnedest thing? It looks like a man, just like Paul." My mouth dropped open. He might as well have said, "The leaves are dropping off the trees." It was no big deal to him. I asked him if he'd ever seen anything like that before. He said, "I could tell you things that make your hair stand up, but you'd think I was insane." It turned out that her father also struggled with mental health issues and throughout his life experienced vivid hallucinations of people that nobody else could see but appeared completely real to him. So could it be that because he had the ability to create such apparitions himself, he was also able to perceive Ruth's hallucination? Shared hallucinations are a real phenomenon, but usually it's the case that one person with psychosis passes on a delusion to somebody else very close to them. It usually spreads because the first person talks about it so much and with such certainty that the second person starts to believe it too. This incident sounds different. Whilst Ruth does prompt her father by suggesting that someone is sitting in the car, it's bizarre that he said he could see the exact same person that Ruth could see. Now, we only have Ruth's word for it that the experience with her dog and her father actually happened. And given how vivid her hallucinations were, how do we know if anyone involved in these stories were really there? Perhaps the man that she thought was her father walking her back to her car was a hallucination too. This next story then is probably the most compelling. Ruth and Paul were at home one day, and Paul was in the kitchen. Ruth was in the front room, but they were having a conversation back and forth between the rooms, as it says in the book. Then he stood up and walked over to the waste paper basket to empty it into the garbage can outside. As he was picking up the basket, he looked at me. When he saw me sitting in the chair near the front door where I'd been sitting all along, he stopped as if he'd seen a ghost. He said, "You were just sitting on the sofa. How did you get over to that chair?" The sofa was several yards away from where I'd been sitting. I asked Paul, in what position had I been sitting on the sofa? He said, "She sat on the sofa and pulled her feet under her so that she was sitting on her feet." I said, "That was an apparition of me that you saw on the sofa. Before you started talking to me, I'd made an apparition and had been talking to it in my mind. It was still there while you and I were talking. I've been sitting in my chair the whole time and haven't moved from it. I haven't been near the sofa." Paul nearly went up the wall. He said, "I'm catching this business of seeing apparitions from you. It's rubbing off on me." I told him that can't be. He wasn't reassured at all. He said, "I feel as if I'm going crazy." Until Paul went for the trash, he hadn't looked in the direction of the real me. He was very upset about what had happened. In bed that night, he felt me all over, saying, "Is that you?" I teased him, saying, "You can't be sure." He made me promise on our marriage vow that I'd never again do an apparition in a room with him. At 3 a.m, he woke me up to get me to promise again. Ruth told Dr. Shatzman about this event, so he rang Paul and asked him about it. Paul was able to confirm that it did happen exactly as she described, so how is that possible? Could it have just been a trick of the lights, or maybe she switched chairs without him realising? Or could it have been something paranormal? A mind projection that was so strong that somehow Paul was able to sense it too? It brings up all kinds of weird possibilities for what Ruth might be experiencing. Telepathy, thought forms, demonic possession. Dr. Shatzman was cautious not to jump to supernatural conclusions though. His primary belief was that Ruth's experiences, however bizarre they seemed, were rooted in the complexities of the human mind, but he also admitted that the case left him with a lot of unanswered questions. Two and a half years after first visiting Morton Shatzman, Ruth was living a fairly normal life. She was happy with her family and with herself. The apparitions no longer bothered her, but she could conjure them up if she felt like it. What became of Ruth afterwards remains a mystery. As far as I can tell, no further information about her life has ever surfaced, and so that's pretty much where the story ends. There's quite a lot of stuff that I couldn't get into this video because it would have been far too long, so if you're interested in this story, I do recommend reading The Story of Ruth. It's an interesting book. So, as I say, I still don't know what to make of this, but I found it interesting and I thought I would share it with you. Let me know what you think, and thank you for watching. Thank you to the patrons for supporting my work. It's highly appreciated as always, and until next time, goodbye.